17 січня працює медіа-центр «Україна-Укрінформ». Мене звати Світлана Чепуренко. І зараз будемо говорити про ситуацію на тимчасово окупованих територіях у 2023 році та виклики, які стоять перед нами у цьому році. Учасники нашого обговорення – Андрій Юсов, представник ГУР Міноборони України, Ihor Solovey, керівник Центру стратегічних комунікацій та інформаційної боротьби Міністерства культури та інформаційної політики та речник Центру національного спротиву Сил спецоперацій України. Хочу одразу зазначити, що наприкінці прес-конференції до нас також приєднається Павло Fiialkovskyi, аналітик OSINT агенції Мольфар, і він представить дуже цікаве і важливе дослідження агента Кремля у рясах, як священнослужителі УПЦ Московського патріархату лобіюють інтереси Росії, тож всіх заохочую залишитися після основної частини прес-конференції. Отже, перейдемо до обговорення. Пане Андрію, я думаю, що спершу за все варто почати з обговорення суспільно-політичної ситуації на тимчасово окупованих територіях, якою вона є, і, можливо, варто зосередитись, зокрема, на темі так званих виборів, які відбулися минулого року, і так званих виборів Путіна, які відбудуться цього року. Який тиск чинять окупанти у зв'язку з виборами на наших українців?
Доброго дня. Так, якщо говорити про так звані вибори, то останні закриті звіти, які передають російські силовики, так звані, на окупованих територіях в центр, це структури, які відповідають, власне, за репресивну політику, це незадовільний стан підготовки, невиконання тих завдань, які кремлівський режим ставить перед окупаційними адміністраціями в контексті підготовки до цього фарсу, який вони називають президентські вибори. Мова йде, зокрема, про провал паспортизації, попри шалений тиск, попри репресії, попри те, що під російську паспортизацію буквально заганяють різноманітними інструментами, прямим тиском, прямими репресіями, а також непрямими заходами через неможливість влаштуватись на роботу, отримати різноманітні довідки, переоформити майно, автомобільний транспорт чи землю. Тим не менше, не дивлячись на всі ці заходи, паспортизація і рівень її незадовільний, не задовільняє і не покриває ті поставлені задачі на всіх тимчасово окупованих територіях, включно із навіть територією ОРДЛО, яка довший період знаходиться під окупацією. Тобто мова йде про окремі райони Донецької, Луганської області, які були окуповані ще до повномасштабного вторгнення. І Кремль не задоволений цими результатами і проводить часткову ротацію і звільнення з посад людей, які відповідають за ці процеси. Також силовики і окупаційні адміністрації звітують про незадоволеність місцевого населення і зростаючи, особливо якщо ми говоримо про окуповані території півдня України, про українські настрої. Мова йде про провал, що стосується проведення і підготовки зимового періоду, опалення, роботи всієї комунальної сфери, роботи громадського транспорту. І нагадаємо, що, власне, за міжнародним гуманітарним правом саме окупанти відповідають за життєзабезпечення окупованих територій, і цю базову функцію вони цілковито провалили. Є те, що фіксують в тих самих закритих звітах загарбники, це зростання руху опору, і мова йде не лише про в цілому про нелояльність місцевого населення, а власне про залученість українців, громадян України на окупованих територіях до безпосередньої участі в актах опору, як в політичному плані, так і, власне, в тому числі в реалізації складних бойових завдань, значна частина яких становить серйозну небезпеку для загарбників. Також, попри великий контингент окупаційної армії на окупованих територіях, загарбники просять збільшити кількість Росгвардії, кількість представників ФСБ і спецслужб для контролю місцевого населення. І звітують власне, нагору, що наявний контингент не може задовольнити, а лише Росгвардії там понад 35 тисяч, не рахуючи співробітників спецслужб, не може гарантувати проведення так званих виборів, власне, згідно поставлених задач і навіть намалювати готовий результат. Тобто, в цілому, попри репресії, попри порушення прав людини, геноцидні практики, насильницьку зміну ідентичності.
Apart from the different pressure events that they are trying to put in place, they cannot guarantee that people are loyal to the local authorities. I will dwell upon that once we have questions from the floor. You mentioned the repressions. What do you know about the work of the Russian special forces in the occupied territories? The special forces by Russia are working as the forces of repression. When we think about the special operations, we think about the counter actions of challenging the subversive activities, whereas the Russian FSB sources and the Russian guards, their main function is to put people in danger and to repress the general pro-Ukrainian situation. They have failed to do so, which means that the pressure will grow all along the board, including the educational sector. And in those classified reports, they report that the younger generation of the Ukrainians are hating the Putin regime. They are not willing to cooperate, which leads to a new wave of repressions against the youngsters, the teenagers. And basically, these young generation are summoned to listen to special lectures. People are arbitrarily restricted in their movements. And in the occupied territories, apart from what they're doing in the Russian Federation per se, there is some resemblance of law enforcement. In the occupied territories, however, people are detained with no formalities explained. People are deprived of their properties, deprived of their computers or smartphones. They have no recourse to the human rights activists or their lawyers, something that we have grown to believe and take for granted in the free world. That is to say, the punitive action is the main force of the Russian Federation to cope with the local authorities, because local population is treated by the Russian aggressor as the enemy. We will talk about the abuse of the human rights, in particular how the occupying force are trying to get entrenched in your territories. First of all, I would like to thank everybody who has made it here and talk about the situation in the temporarily occupied territories. The topic is very important. This is part and parcel of our life. This is part of the lives of the people that we are working with in our opposing the aggression. We believe, as Mr. Yusov has suggested, they are failing in their efforts. They want to have more people, including the FSB and Russian guards, to come to Ukraine. This has to do with the fact that they are not coping with our partisan movement. This is something that we always communicate about. The occupying force have understood that the basic ways of rooting out the guerrilla movements, they have failed there. They're searching for them, but with no success. Beginning from the summer of last year, they have initiated the so-called moving checkpoints. There are 2 vehicles that stop at any place and they set up a checkpoint there. That is to say, there are no rules how the people's documents are checked. If you have a Ukrainian passport and you refused to receive a Russian passport, that is a ground to be sent to the torture cells. Tortures would take place from week to 2 weeks. That is to say, these filtration camps have different procedures. There are different people, there are different situations. Some people do understand that they are not supposed to be vociferous about their pro-Ukrainian position. Some people are very much open about that. And we say this is a sad situation, because when you get emotional in your responses to the occupying force, you are likely to be detained. In order to overcome these practices, they engage in the following procedures. These include ethnical cleansing and deporting people from the Ukrainian territories. For example, in the temporarily occupied Mariupol, we have about 50,000 representatives of the Central Asian republics. That is to say, Ukrainians have been deported into the so-called depressive areas of Russia. At the same time, the occupying force centrally are trying to find people who would work with them, including the criminal elements. They are promising flats, housing, to make sure that they participate in the war against Ukraine. One of the methods is, as of today, at the state level, this is what they discuss now, to make legitimate the criminal forces to fight in Ukraine. They will make sure that their presence in Ukraine will be legit. One of the challenges that you mentioned is the children's genocide. As for this summer, we have noted thousands of Ukrainian children that have been deported from Ukraine. Methods are different. For example, boarding schools. This is the simplest way for the Russians to deport Ukrainian people. These children have been deported from the boarding schools. Another methodology is as follows. These are the medical examination. What they say is that these particular children need some medical treatment, and more often than not, these children would not return to Ukraine. There are other social programs in Russia when they are issuing documents for the children to be adopted. This is run at the government level. The so-called representative of the Russian Federation for the children's responsible person, a person, Lvova Belova, who has been already searched by the court in Hague, which is to say that she is a war criminal. We have also issued a report covering last year. In the corridor, you will find a copy in Ukrainian and in English with the maps of the so-called children's sanatoria where children are sent to. We are assessing the infrastructure situation and other factors influencing this situation. We have also this document available on our site. As for the education, how the occupying force is using the schools and how are they using the disinformation and propaganda. This Center for Strategic Communication is constantly following the developments, including the situation in the information sphere. What we see as far as 2023 is concerned is the Kremlin nature of propaganda that has been imposed in the temporarily occupied territories, newly occupied, although that had been occupied before, which means that there is a plethora of different instruments that they are using. They are using and taking advantage of all the resources, beginning from the wire radio programs, the different newspapers, announcements, electronic and other means, posters and bills. That is to say, every local administration has set up a Telegram channel. They have been also made to make sure that all the heads of the regional administrations, although these channels would have no more than 100 subscribers, but they are pushing for the Russian propaganda, and they share the information created by Balitsky or Saldo. The network of the Telegram channels is widespread. They are setting up different groups, including the Russian networks of Odnoklassniki and in Kontakte. Since last year, the groups are not there because they have cancelled and banned the Facebook. Rumors is another area where they are striving. They share the rumors like in Volnovakha, everyone knows that there is a wood, and near that wood there is a special equipment installed that records everyone who is phoning people in Ukraine. This is the element of terror and intimidation, but this proves to be a very efficient strategy. Another trend of the last year is the following. The local propagandists have been changed with the people coming from the Russian Federation, and the propagandists from the temporarily occupied territories have been moved to the Russian Federation. Another issue here is the educational spectrum and schools. We have seen an increase of number of teachers with the Russian citizenship. This is explained by both monetary factors and others. People coming from Russia receive more than their colleagues in the temporarily occupied territory that have been occupied before. These additions imply that these teachers are used as ideological pushers of the Russian agenda. And the fact is that Ukrainian language or Ukrainian songs are heard less and less in those occupied territories. Another, or rather to sum up then, the year 2023 has seen that all the carrots in terms of money bonuses has been changed by the repressions. Firstly, it's because people are forced to receive Russian citizenship. The repressions are exerted against all people who have refused to assume Russian citizenship. This is what my colleagues have mentioned already. People are refused the medical care, they are restricted in their movements, and even in the spread of the rumors, like the following, the mothers of those people who have been detained in the temporarily occupied territories. What people are saying is that those mothers or relatives will not be able to give some help to the people who have been detained. The further the situation worsens, the more we see the rumors about a upcoming deportation of new people. These rumors have been propelled in 2023, and what they explain is this, that the more vigorous people will be subject to the separation of the parents from their children. Again, this is the background to make sure that more Ukrainians are receiving Russian passports. As a takeaway, the more we are into the Russian occupation, the tougher and more cruel the environment becomes. Our forecast is as follows. Our colleagues are doing the field research in the Zaporizhia and other oblasts. What they see is that the people in the occupied territories are waiting for the liberation. The resistance movement is not necessarily very active or seeable. Sometimes it takes the form of the so-called silent sabotage and the refusal to cooperate with occupying authorities. And there are also the networks between the people who have been living in the occupied territories. In this situation, a very important role is attached to the ties with the Ukrainian authorities. People must receive information from Ukraine when they are in the know of what's going on in Ukraine. This ties with Ukraine must be sustainable. It falls upon all of us to ensure that there is a communication with the people in the occupied territories. My colleague has mentioned the Telegram channels. One of the Telegram channels, I will tell you that it's an example of the participation of the Ukrainian collaborators at the upper echelons. It all tells us that this is fake and manipulation. When you find a telegram of Kirilo Strimousov, who is now dead, that channel is still thriving. That is to say, a deceased person is sharing his information, which is to say, what kind of information the so-called Strimousov channel is sharing. This is part of the general campaign of disinformation. All these puppets like Pushilin or Saldo, they are the talking heads, the fake faces of the so-called administration, because de facto, the Kremlin has appointed their people to be helping, aiding, and abetting the local collaborators to carry out all the orders from the Kremlin. This also has to do with the embezzlement of the government money. One of the vice premiers of Russia has launched the so-called development program of the Ukrainian territories, but in fact this is the matter of embezzling government money. The people that he has installed in the so-called Russian occupational administrations are doing just the same. As for the administration, what we are seeing today is the preparation for the so-called voting for the Russian president. People have been allowed to vote with the Ukrainian passports. This is to say, what a botched operation this has proven to be. Although they have already reported that 90% of Ukrainians have received Russian passport. Then they were talking about 98% of the turning out at the polls. But the fact remains the fact. Ukrainians are refusing to take on Russian citizenship, although they are facing a humanitarian crisis. People without a Russian passport are refused the medical care, and this is done purposefully. In other words, one of the elements of their politics including the winterization. People with the Ukrainian passports, for example, see the outages in their lighting, but people refuse to take on the Russian passport. This is a non-violent resistance, because there are different types of resistance, combat or non-combat. What we are seeing is that Ukrainians continue to fight the aggressor. We are partly concluding the results of the last year. There must be a positive side of this year, in particular the Special Operation Forces achievements. In your view, what has been the most successful operations by the Ukrainian Special Operation Forces? Of course, this was a very intensive year, and a number of successful operations have been conducted in the temporarily occupied territories, including the destruction of the forces and the destruction of the collaborators. This work would not be possible without an active participation of the local population. They have been gathering and sharing the information with the Ukrainian forces, and including their personal inclusion in such operations. The involvement of the local population in our special operations is explained by the fact that they have not been able to cope with this movement. In spite of all their efforts to combat and overcome the guerrilla movement, they cannot make sure that we are not receiving the information from the occupied territories. That is to say, that the drones that fly into the windows of the offices where the occupying forces are having their briefings, and the depots that have been, weapon depots that have been destroyed, is a joint effort of the Special Operation Forces and the resistance movement of the local population. In 2023 up to the 2024, these operations will grow in scope, including the Crimean Peninsula. And let me remind you that there are territories that have been under Russian Federation before the full-scale invasion. The localities that were supposed to be the showcase, including cities like Mariupol, something that Putin was dreaming about. Another issue, the corruption. All these renovation projects is only throwing sand in the eyes of the population. The Ukrainians who didn't know where the truth was, given that they don't have the access to the open and true information, they have seen with their own eyes the nature of the Russian occupying force, who are treating the local population as enemies. Of course, there have been a number of successive combat operations, raids, the situation in the Black Sea area and in the Crimea. Ukrainian drones are working in the air, on the sea, and believe me that this activities will be continued with the help of the population in the temporarily occupied territories. Another component of the fight in the occupied territories is the search for truth. You will remember the Novocherkassk situation. Due to the efforts of the activists, we have known the number of lost personnel at that ship. 74 military personnel have been killed at the Novocherkassk ship. That is one of the elements how we are trying to communicate with the local population, and this is the result of our work. This is the truth. This testifies to our capability, and it tells you a lot about how successful we have been. Because of the underground forces, we would not have been able to be that successful. The Special Operation forces strikes against Berdyansk and Lugansk enemy depots is part of the joint effort, because we have non-combat ways, for example, sharing information, which helps us to know how to be more precise, more successful. They are informing us about the movement of the enemy, where the facilities have been placed. The enemy understands that, and they would play their equipment behind the kindergartens, in the schoolyards, or in the premises of the medical facilities. This is a routine procedure. Sometimes they try to have a number of civil personnel in those medical centers, but the majority of them are military. And this is the information that we are receiving from the local population. According to the data we have, the resistance is growing, and the level of the anti-Russian sentiment is about 70% among the general population. What are the key challenges for the Ukrainian defense forces and the local underground movement? What is the priority number one? Is it the election of the Russian president? Now, of course, the so-called election is not the challenge for the forces of defense and protection, because the plans for deoccupying, they will not be influencing us. This is the matter for the international community to consider, because the regime of President Putin is a dictatorship. He has usurped the power, but what we are seeing is that he's losing the last resemblances of the legitimacy. The annexation and occupation of the internationally recognized Ukrainian territories, and all this farce has deprived the Putin regime of international legitimate character. This is the matter for the international community to react to force and frame their diplomacy. Yes, the challenges for the Ukrainian defense and protection forces is the security and defense of the people living in the occupied territories. That's why they are hiding their military equipment in the vicinity of the civil facilities. This is the practice that they have been scaling up all the time along, beginning with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, including the kindergarten and schools where the military personnel are placed, and the equipment and military equipment have also been seen. For example, they're using the kindergartens for their military to play the Russian Guards forces and other occupying force, and we are seeing that this practice is non-stop. This is a terror and genocidal practice that is called to make the work of the Ukrainian armed forces more difficult. However, due to the efforts of the local population, we know those localities, and all the special operations have been developed with the view of those tendencies and developments. I would divide the situation into two parts. One is temporarily occupied territories and international community. When we talk about that voting, it's a simulacrum. In say, you see, the election and Russia are a matter of a stand-up comedy. However, they're trying to put up that show with the help of the propaganda to make sure that they are seen as legitimate force in the occupied territories. The election there is an evidence of that. It's important for Putin to show how the temporarily occupied territories are integrated into Russian Federation. At the same time, the underground movement knows what to do. We know how to see the difference between those people who are forced to show that they're ready to cooperate, and we also know people who have done it willingly, and they have volunteered to cooperate with the enemy. We know these people, we have the lists of them, and it's high time that they should think about what they're doing and not collaborating with the occupying forces. We know that Russian forces are also taking advantage of the criminals and so on. Our underground movement has all the data. They will contribute to the gathering of data for the future criminal hearings for the war crimes. You see, we should tell them that people who are sick with collaboration sickness, this is very dangerous, because our guerrillas will know who these people are, and this is very dangerous for their future health. Another issue in this issue is the international cooperation. Russians are likely to use their influences and influencers in the different international communities, including Europe, to make sure that they are legitimized in Europe and in the eyes of the European public. They will show that the election booths are ready, that this is a democratic process. They will conduct a number of briefings and have different blogs by the pseudo-journalists and pseudo-pundits in different European communities and markets. When we talk about the informational market, this is a challenge for our journalist community. This is a situation where Ukrainian journalists must help the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian government to fight that propaganda and disinformation. I challenge you to support the temporarily occupied territories, not to allow that our partners are not fed propaganda. We must be fighting for truth. This is why we come together to communicate, to tell you. And we are suggesting some analytical process. You see, this is not our key factor of activity, but we are doing this now, and we are challenging you to help the Ukrainian armed forces and help Ukraine in general. Journalists, if you have questions, please. I have a question for Mr. Yusov. Recently, we have heard the information to the fact that the Belarusian forces are being trained in Russia. Do you think it's a true information? Do you think that the Belarusian army is likely to be used by the Russian Federation for the fight in Ukraine? And the second question, if I may, do you think, according to your knowledge, is it true that Russia is likely to have mobilized 2,100 recruits by February? You see, the dream of dreams of Mr. Putin is to get engaged the Belarusian army to the land operations on their side to fight in Ukraine. All over the period of the full-scale war, Putin has failed to pressure Belarusian authorities into fighting in Ukraine. Situation has not changed. Yet there are different military exercises that they're having. They're talking about the so-called joint state, about the joining of their efforts in the security and defense sector. That topic will be there. Of course, it serves a propaganda service. There is a cooperation, of course, in the sector of security. We have seen that the equipment and ammunition from Russia is delivered to Russia, to Belarus. But currently, we don't see a situation where Belarusian armed forces will be fighting in Ukraine. This is not a ground for us to be relaxed. We are monitoring the situation. As for the rest of that, sometimes they want to attract more attention to this or to exaggerate the situation, we hear the news bulletin that we are likely to see the encroachment of the Belarusian army. You should be following only the authoritative news outlets. As for the mobilization, more likely than that, this will be in full swing after the so-called election. Now they are conducting mobilizing steps in the territory of the Russian Federation, including the recruiting and forcing people into signing contracts as international components. They are also taking advantage of the criminal elements. We are now having a question in English, please.
Добрий день, мене звати Christopher з Natsec Media. First, do you have recommendations for family and friends of occupied territory families of how they should consider communicating for security purposes? And the second one is regarding international journalists. Are you seeing coverage that harms your efforts, or do you have any needs that the Western journalists are not paying attention to in some capacity for you? Дякую.
Так, дякую за запитання. Щодо першого пункту,
Thank you for your question. As for the question number one, on our website, we have a number of recommendations how to behave in the temporarily occupied territories. This is one of the major aspects of our work in terms of the non-combat fighting. It's not about academic or theoretical issues. It involves practical advice for people who are living there, for people who have left the temporarily occupied territories. On the website, that is to say, we have such an information. As for the second part of your question, it's quite difficult to provide a subjective take on that. What is my assessment? What we are seeing at the center of informational resistance, we see that there is a support by the international journalist corps supporting Ukraine, and we appreciate that support. The major and up channels like BBC and CNN are having their bulletins on Ukraine on daily basis. Of course, this is the biggest armed conflict in Europe since World War II. So I think this is being appreciated, and we have received international support. Luckily enough, the attention to the Russian aggression against Ukraine is continuing. However, Russia is trying to flood their narratives and push their narratives. For example, the freezing of the conflict. They talk about something as if in eastern part of Ukraine, Ukrainians were waiting for Putin to come in. We see those Russian narratives parroted by influencers in the West. It is important after such sound bites to underline the fact that the temporarily occupied territories have been occupied by force. They have been killing local population. Children and other people have been forced to move from Ukraine. Government institutions are not efficient. The choice of the Ukrainian people, apart from the language that they consider to be their native language, about their ethnic or religious backgrounds, their vision is to live in an independent European Ukraine. Russian aggression cannot be justified. The presence of the Russian forces in all the Ukrainian territories doesn't have any justification or explanation from the point of view of the international law or the United Nations politics. This is the message that Ukraine will repeat day in and day out, and we ask the Western partners of ours to push that agenda when you're covering the situation in the temporarily occupied territories. Apart from the website of the National Resistance Movement, at our Center for Strategic Information, we also share information, some materials, the rules of behavior, the advice how to behave, informational hygiene, the rules how to communicate with the occupying force, that we are likely to target the local population. We are sharing that information, specifically targeting people in the occupied territories. We know that, and we want these people to understand that their own safety is priority number one. But I would like also to draw your attention to the fact that the communication with these people who have been forced to live under these circumstances, they need a good word from Ukraine. They need encouragement from Ukraine. This is a tie that connects them with the Ukrainian life. The Russians understand that once they occupy a new place, they are trying to set up an information digital ghetto, cutting off these territories and the local Ukrainian population from Ukraine, from the Ukrainian information space. Our challenge is not to let that happen. We want to be in constant contact with our people. Kiev Independent, Alexander Hrebet, you mentioned that there is a classified information by the Russians in their effort to issue Russian passports. If they're not happy with the situation, what is their goal? What is their target? Generally speaking, how many people are now living in the temporarily occupied territories? Specific data, in many cases, are difficult to calculate. The occupying forces themselves, when they report upstream, or sometimes say that this is a ballpark figure. Many housings have been vacated. There can be a one person from the family that looks after a number of houses or a number of flats. So it's quite difficult to claim that we have specific numbers. As we speak about bigger cities, in Mariupol, for example, has now population which is fewer than half of the population compared to the pre-war. In other cities, people have left for the Ukrainian territories. Others have been deported to the Russian Federation. This is the fluid data that must be calculated. As for the official information, even for their propaganda, they are not pinpointing specific figures. The current flow, they are saying that people are forced into receiving Russian passports. We are talking about hundreds, not about thousands or hundreds of thousands, which might have been their plans. I will add to this the following information. The Russians are trying to make as much information as possible in terms of the classified information, including their combat losses. There has been a recent order to make secret, for example, the money that have been paid for the loss of their relatives at the front line. And they are doing this to make sure that we and no one can calculate the number of casualties there. It's quite challenging to have a specific number of people. You see, if we are talking about Horlivka in the temporarily occupied territories, up to 20,000 people have been forced for mobilization. We don't know their fate because they have been taken to Luhansk or Donetsk militia. You see, they are part of this cannon fodder that are used in the storming of the Ukrainian army. So it's difficult to provide specific data. You mentioned that at the website that you run, you have some advice for people living in the temporarily occupied territories. At the same time, you have also mentioned that the Russians have a a widespread network that are working in the occupied territories, whereas we have seen and we have heard about two outlets. What other means of reaching to people in the temporarily occupied territories? We have different Viber channels and Telegram channels that are accessible there, and we are trying to reach new segments there. And of course, our IT specialists are trying to make sure that our information is not blocked there. Although they're trying to block as many channels as possible, look, if they're using the Russian providers, it's quite difficult. They're using VPN, and there are other methods that I'm not willing to make public now. There are some methodological issues that we are sharing in the form of files, but there are other means of reaching out to those people. Let me add here that it's self-evident that every division of the defense forces have their own element: chatbots, electronic addresses, VPN instruments. These are used by the national resistance, by the Ukrainian Secret Service, by the armed forces. The communication sometimes takes the form: you have received it, you have forgotten it. That is to say, we instruct people how to make sure that there are no ways to track down that information. Once we receive a message from the temporarily occupied territories, we tell them online how to make sure that they are staying safe, how to make sure that the information that we share is safe. Of course, I'm not in position to share all the tools we are using, but there is a range of ways how to communicate with Ukraine. VPN, at the end of the day, is one of the most used instruments both in Russia and in the temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories. The only thing I have to say is this: temporarily occupied territories is a genuine Ukrainian territories where Ukrainians live. We know everything what's going on there, and we also know what channels they are receiving the information through. In our case, it's a situation where the information follows the user. We see what kind of channel they're using, and we are serving their needs. I would like to address the spokesperson of the Resistance Center. You mentioned that up to 50,000 Russians coming from Central Asian areas of Russia have been settled in there. What is the situation in other cities like Skadovsk? Mr. Yusov, can I ask you about the risks of the fact that Iran will transfer ballistic missiles to Russia? As for the ethnic situation, it's going everywhere, but the Russians seem to have started with the major cities. Mariupol that you have mentioned, this is a showcase that Russians are trying to show their success. When we talk about temporarily occupied territories, we know the situation about Mariupol. The Crimean Peninsula is a different story. Of course, it's taking place in different cities. Apart from that, they don't have enough medical personnel for their war. In order to serve the Russian military and the Russians working there, you see, in many administrations, they have brought in a lot of Russians from different regions, including depressed regions in Russia. They are appointed as heads of the departments and heads of the different organizations. These medical brigades work in different communities in different cities. This is how they're trying to fill in our temporarily occupied territories with the specialists like that. You see, your question does not necessarily relate to our topic. Iran is not a temporarily occupied territory, but there is a threat of that. while the military-industrial complex of Russia is failing to meet the needs in terms of the ammunition of the unmanned aerial vehicles and ballistic missiles. Yet the Russians are searching around the world, and those places are well known. Is there a threat? Yes, there is. We know about the requests by Russia in 2023, but we have not recorded a fact of transfer of ballistic missiles from Iran into Russia, but we are keeping track of that. Marina Vakreva, 1+1 TV channel. I would like to address all the speakers here. We have heard the takeaway of the year 2023. Yes, people are being Russified, ideologically and otherwise. How do you see the Ukrainization of that population after those territories have been liberated? What's your take on that? Very unfortunately, apart from the panelists that you see here, we don't have specialists on that. We are representing enforcement forces that are different. I will not be talking for the Ministry for Reintegration. I will talk about the steps that must be done in the information area. First, we will have to renew the access of the formerly occupied territories to the Ukrainian information space and system, to the Ukrainian media area. And this must be done because people who have been living for a long time under the occupation, and I reiterate my point, they have been living in the information ghetto where information is misused, people are disinformed, and the first step to take is to resume the informational sovereignty in those territories. The next steps would have to do with the financial efforts and other efforts that every ministry will work out in terms of their responsibilities. Radio freedom. You have touched upon the issue of how people are brought from Russian Federation. Do we understand now who are these people who are trying to settle themselves in the Ukrainian territories? Socially speaking, who are they? You mentioned the medical personnel. What other specialists the Russians are trying to resettle here in Ukraine? The second issue is how Ukrainians, what kind of challenges they face when they're trying to leave occupied territories. There must be people that are having different disabilities. The people who have been coming to Ukraine, firstly, they are coming from the so-called socially depressed territories. They are promised monetary success, they are promised different positions, and these are the kind of people that are coming to the temporarily occupied territories. As for the medical personnel, we have also teachers coming in, specialists in energy. For example, in Energodar, we know about the nuclear power plant. The staff has been changed there in many ways, and there are Russians coming to work at the nuclear power plants. The punitive bodies, the so-called prosecutor's office and the courts, they are stuffed with the Russians. These people are promised bonuses, money, and again, they're coming mostly from the depressed territories because you will not see people coming from Moscow to work in Lugansk, but it's working for the socially unprivileged person. And they are doing that on a rotation basis. Medical brigades, for example, rotate every 4 months, and that goes on also for the nuclear power plant. The major share of collaborating with the enemy were the railroad specialists. Ukrainian railroad specialists did not cooperate that people have to come from Russia. As for the issue of leaving occupied territories. It's not exactly the realm when I am professional. There are other people that would know about that. But I know that these people are having a lot of challenges. We know about the so-called greater circle from Russia into Baltic states or to Georgia to leave Russia and get into Ukraine. Russians make a point of blocking such possibilities. As for the leaving, of course, the circumstances are quite challenging and terrific. It has to do with a number of risks. We know about the filtration camps. We know about the abuse and the threats of the so-called law enforcement bodies of Russia. Yes, people are going through the third countries, or they're trying to get into Ukraine from different Russian regions. Their point would be to leave Russia for at least some time that they can afford financially into a second country. But people are aware that they will be under pressure in terms of their ownership and so on. But people do take a very serious pay attention to safety of their children and for the safety of their our own. We are encouraging such people. As for bringing in new population, we have seen Crimea and Mariupol as the major example of people coming from Russia. As for the engagement of the Russian population, in general, they seem to have failed because mostly these are categories. There are people who are coming to Ukraine to make some money and go back to Russia. People who come here as social workers or teachers, they understand that they are part of the occupation core. They know the negative treatment of their activities, of the fact of their coming to Ukraine, so they are not very much likely to be willing to stay, which is to say that they don't believe that Russian occupation will last forever. Yes, they want to make some money. They want to see the Black Sea, the Azov Sea. They are promised that they will be given the ownership of the housing that has been vacated by the Ukrainians. These are the stimuli that they hear and they are enticed. But their major enticement is to make some money. Yes, it's not the amount of money that the Russian military are making here, but at least they're not likely to be killed in action, as goes for the cannon fodder campaigns. All these people coming from Russia are saying that they don't feel safe here, and this is right to claim. Public broadcast, I would like to ask a person who is not on the panel, it seems. Perhaps who of the panelists will tell us how it is safe to leave Crimea, not to participate in the presidential election or not to be forced into Russian citizenship. There are open and public recommendations. It applies both to the temporarily occupied territories and the Crimean Peninsula. People are aware that this is a complex route. You're leaving to a third country. One or the other way, you go through the Russian Federation. There are recommendations of that kind available in the public domain. We will be now talking about the church members that are serving the interests of the Russian Federation. We thank the panelists, and we will be moving over to the second part of our press conference.
Я перепрошую.